Yes. If you put a slideshow, ma'am, that will be it.
Slideshow now, is it?
Uh, okay,
It's not slideshow.
should be fine.
Yes, madam. It is
Yes.
slide share only now.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just going to present this today's topic as case-based scenario, and then we can answer the questions later at the end. So all these are outpatient scenarios, and the highlight is when to do the test, what drugs, when to refer, most important. Because identifying the patient the right time to refer is the most important outcome. Because the timing any drug that is used in COVID is based on whether it is the first week, it is a viremic phase, or the second phase, the inflammatory, and later on the post-inflammatory phase. So it's important that we understand the timeline of COVID, and it is not difficult at all because these are only hardly few symptoms that you are going to monitor, and most of it is now done as teleconsult. That I understand that many of you may not have the facility of teleconsult. I don't know whether a telephonic follow-up even is possible for many of these cases because that is all is needed to understand when to admit a patient, call for admission because we cannot be admitting all of them who are under follow-up. So I'll start with this case of a 63-year-old female and who was having a rheumatoid arthritis and is already on hydroxychloroquine for the last 20 years. You know, this is being used, I don't know, even now it's being used, I don't know, but it's widely used till months for COVID. Then comorbidities, she presents with 2 days history of sore throat, fever, and a SARS-CoV PCR is negative. Husband is COVID positive. Okay, so we all know probably this lady is also affected with COVID. COVID PCR is negative. So, what will you offer the treatment as? Will you give azithromycin? Will you give ivermectin plus doxycycline? Favipiravir, or will you give symptomatic treatment or systemic steroids because she has fever? So, this is the common scenario that we come across. Day 2 of symptoms of URI, and one test of RT-PCR is negative, and husband is positive. So, any take on this case? The thing is, we all know that azithromycin is still in Tamil Nadu protocol, as I understand. But azithromycin is out several months ago because it is proved futile in the recovery trial. Kerala government has not included any antibiotic. That's the best thing. Have not included any antibiotic in the protocol. So azithromycin will not help in a. It's not an antiviral first of all, and it will not help in this patient where you have suspect COVID. So first of all, our aim should to try and make a diagnosis by doing a repeat test if the lab is, if you suspect that lab report is wrong, or maybe the swab you need to repeat, as you know, only there is an 80% sensitivity with a single swab. It is important, especially in this lady who's 63-year-old, to have a diagnosis of COVID, or if you want to label as COVID suspect and even it's negative, please follow her as COVID positive because she's household contact and she has symptoms of COVID. So my point is azithromycin is out. It is no more in the formula for treatment for COVID. Ivermectin and doxycycline. This was very much popular, especially in the north, and even ICMR guide was there. We all know that ivermectin, again, we don't have enough evidence, and the RCT has shown that ivermectin is not effective and it is not recommended. Doxycycline is again an antibiotic. Ivermectin and doxycycline came into practice because of its the popular Bangladesh study, but the evidence is not strong, so we no longer use, though there are some recommendations. Favipiravir is an antiviral drug. Okay, will that be helpful? Probably yes, but the evidence is not there. We have one study which I'll show you in the coming slides. Favipiravir is an antiviral which can be used in the first week, but we don't have strong evidence. But it has quite a few side effects. One is pill burden, the number of pills that one has to take, and the GI and the liver side effects, which needs to be monitored. What about symptomatic measure? Yes, she has sore throat fever. We all know for the COVID, the fever can last about 5 to 7 days. So should be given symptomatic treatment or should she be given systemic steroids? The absolute no for this, all the choices, systemic steroids. Please don't give systemic steroids for in the first 7 days, is unless they have hypoxia, because this is what the problem that we face with the second outbreak of mucormycosis along with COVID. Systemic steroids use, especially in such patients, will do more harm than good. So this is not the patient. Systemic steroids for sure no. Cycling, I would say no, because we don't have evidence. Azithromycin is out, so you have your guideline. Favipiravir, there are some role, but with its own side effects. The best thing is symptomatic measure, but need to be followed up because these patients have high comorbidities and she has fever. So these patients has to be followed up throughout the first and up to 10th day, at least with an alternate day or every third day, at least by a phone call. Coming to the second case, this is a 69-year-old male with who has undergone a PTCI and has hypertension, has acute febrile illness, a temperature of 1 or 2, COVID tested was positive, and saturation is normal. The patient has taken, he has taken azithromycin and a course of ivermectin, and day 3 presents with cough and ongoing fever. We all know, though there are guidelines, there are 100 different prescriptions that is used for COVID in various cocktails, because these are cheap, these are available over the counter, and because of the most of the information that we get is from social media than from the correct information from the journal. So when we see a patient, the patient will already mostly on 1 or 2 drugs or at least a combination of immune boosters. So this patient comes on day 3 with a fever and cough. And this is the pattern of fever. So at this point, what investigation should be done is the next question. Do you want to do any investigation on day 3? Do you want to do a CBC CRP D-dimer on day 1? Or you want to do this on day 5? Do you want to give LDH and ferritin also and interleukin-6 in such patients? Or do you want to do imaging as well? Okay. So as we all know, the COVID itself produced a lot of inflammation. So the CRP elevation is expected in COVID, and it can go up to 50 and in some cases above 100. And this happens even in the initial days. So doing a CBC, CRP and D-dimer is useless. We all know that we are treatment on day 1, because 80% to 90% improve on its own. We're not going to manage them with any antiviral on day 1. And there's no point doing all this test and it's a waste of money. The right time to do a test will be around day 5 if they are symptomatic. And what is the minimum test that is needed is only CBC, CRP and D-dimer, and no LDH, ferritin and interleukin-6 is needed. Because if CRP is elevated, we all know the ferritin will be simultaneously elevated, because both these are inflammatory markers. And IL-6 is no longer done in a hospital, even if the patient is in ICU, because our use of tocilizumab use, for which this was used widely, is not based on IL-6, but on clinical status, as well as the Oxten recommend while on Dexona. So the test that is ideally that to be done is CBC, CRP and D-dimer, which gives more information than any other test, and it should not be done on day 1, which is a waste of money. It should be done on day 5, especially if they are symptomatic. If they are asymptomatic, no test is needed. And if the patient is ambulant and home isolation, no test is needed. If the patient is not ambulant, probably a D-dimer or an anticoagulant or a subcutaneous heparin may be needed, especially for thromboprophylaxis. So the correct option will be the third one, especially if the patient has symptoms. The test that is blood test that is to be done is on day 5. And what do we look for? In the counts, we look for lymphocytopenia, That is, actually it's a mark of to identify those who will progress to severe disease. And a neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. If you have a complete blood count, if you look at the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio that is more than 3.13, it is an independent risk factor for severe disease. And a red cell width of more than 14.5% also suggests that the patient can go into severe disease. So the right test is minimum test that is to be done is around day 5 on those symptomatic. If they are symptomatic early, you can do on day 4. That's not a strict rule, but doing before that is pointless. Coming to case 3. Again, this is a 63-year-old female who has the similar scenario, rheumatoid arthritis on HCQ, and has a fever and presents on day 5 with cough. So you do that test of CBC, CRP and D-dimer, and you find that the counts are normal, there is some lymphopenia, and the CRP is marginally elevated in the range of 40, and the D-dimer is around 500 to 600. In this patient, what treatment would you offer? Again, this is an outpatient. This patient's saturation is normal, he not be admitted. And will you offer azithromycin based on the immunomodulatory effect? But we know that with the recovery trial, there's no effect on mortality or disease progression. So it has gone to the dustbin. We no longer use. Second is whether ivermectin and with doxycycline can be used. It was used widely, but with the recent guidelines, we have again not using anymore. Favipiravir is an antiviral drug. As I said, I'll show the evidence for it. But what is needed for her is symptomatic, that is antipyretic plus inhaled corticosteroids. We also look into what is the evidence for the inhaled corticosteroids in the coming slides. Again, the no is for systemic steroids. In this patient, day 5, unless she has exertional breathlessness or an X-ray showing infiltrate, or when you walk, that is 6-minute walk test and then followed by hypoxia. All this can be done at home. These are the indications for systemic steroids. Till then, antipyretic and inhaled corticosteroids with least side effects are the preferred treatment. With more and more use of systemic steroids, what we see is a surge of mucormycosis. So, ivermectin, this guideline has actually made a clear recommendation about what is the use of ivermectin. The recommendation for non-severe illness, conditional recommendations against use because it is not found to be useful. Severe illness, conditional recommendations against use, and critical illness, again, it's against use. Why? Because it is not found to be of benefit. What about favipiravir? We have several trials, but that one conducted in India and is published in the done by Umang and published in this journal of IJID, where it is Dr. Udwadia has done the trial, and what they have shown in this trial is a trend towards early viral clearance, but this doesn't account or meet or doesn't mean the primary endpoint, that is, which is progression of the disease. What about inhaled budesonide in the treatment of early COVID-19? This is called the STOIC trial, where they found that in early COVID, if it is used in 7 days at the dose of 400 per accentuation, that is 2 doses morning and evening, a total dose of 1600 per day, results in quicker resolution of fever as well as cough. It also reduces the likelihood of requiring urgent care, emergency department consultation, and hospitalization. So how does it help? In vitro studies have shown that inhaled glucocorticoids reduce the replication of SARS-CoV-2 in airway epithelial cells, in addition to the downregulation of the expression of ACE2 and TMPR recessive genes, which are critical for the viral entry. So this is less harmful and can be used as an outpatient therapy. So this is the graph that shows that those who use budesonide, the clinical recovery is statistically significant. So when should we start inhaled corticosteroids? A new onset cough and fever or anosmia or both that occurs within 7 days were included in the study. And this is the dose, that is 600 per day, that is 800 microgram in the morning and night for 7 to 14 days. It can be used with a revoluizer or an inhaler with spacer. So it can be used as a rotocap form or an inhaler. It's not used very early. And coming to this is what we follow in our hospital. So to summarize what I have said so far and to simplify the treatment, we don't want multiple long prescription, which we usually see. I'm just briefing about the category. There may be some mix match between states about how you categorize the disease. Mild disease is category A. Category B is moderate disease without hypoxia, where you have a lot of comorbidities, pregnancy, and severe symptoms, but not really amounting to hypoxia. And then you have a category C, where you have two groups. One is between 90 to 93, and another group is less than 90%, where usually they are in high dependency unit or ICUs. So I'm not going to comment on either C1 or C2 or those hypoxic. I'm going to focus today only on category A and B. So category A is a mild disease where you have sore throat and rhinitis. What we advise is home isolation, but we give teleconsult or a telephonic follow-up, whichever is possible in your setting. What is all needed is a short CBC CRP and if needed X-ray and probably a D-dimer. Nothing more is needed. This is all needed to decide sometimes for admission and to decide whether heparin is needed. There is no need for IL-6, LDH, ferritin as an outpatient therapy. It doesn't help you in deciding anything more. Coming to category B, these are patients with fever and severe respiratory distress in the form of cough, or they may be pregnant or elderly or with comorbidities, where you need very careful observation. An alternate teleconsult will be ideal. It can be telephonic consult to decide on their symptoms, their oxygenation, 6-minute walk text to know whether they have hypoxia, and whether they need home lab collection, where you can review the lab result and decide on admission that later day and plan CT chest. So what is needed when they get admitted? This is not for OP. If they are getting admitted, you can ask for a basic AST and ALT to know, because whether they will need remdesivir, whether their LFT is okay. They may need an ECG, chest X-ray, CRP, sugar. HRCT if they have persistent symptoms, and or if they are getting admitted even with or without hypoxia. We don't do HRCT for all patients. Very few get HRCT done in a hospital. So we decide the patient who will need HRCT based on the inflammatory markers and their symptoms, which are cough and exertional breathlessness, to decide whether they need remdesivir. Once the patient is hypoxic, we don't do CT, because anyhow the treatment is with steroids. So those group, unless during the treatment, their oxygen requirement increases, where you have to rule out a pulmonary embolism or any other secondary bacterial pneumonia, we don't do repeat HRCT if the patient is improving. I have seen several cases where they have done all the labs, including LDH and IL-6, and a CT on day 1, and which doesn't serve any purpose, because in day 1, CT will be normal. And they are happy with the CT, so that they are very sure that their COVID is not severe, and they never follow up and come on 10th day with dyspnea and exertion and hypoxia, and they straight away go to the ICU. So this HRCT done in the first 5 days, I would say, is useless. Again, waste of your money. I strongly recommend against it, because it gives a false impression that they are okay. So what is the treatment then? For category A, it's only symptomatic treatment. As I said, they have mild symptoms. I don't even prescribe Bicosils or zinc containing vitamins, because I don't know how far the zinc can cause or help in mucormycosis. So I give whatever based on their symptoms, I treat them. Maybe paracetamol. If they have only nasal block, I advise steam inhalation. Not steam inhalation is not routinely advised for everybody. It doesn't help. If they want to have multivitamin, I advise vitamin D, because of all the vitamins, vitamin D has probably a better evidence than any other vitamins. And I advise any other supplements. If they have any cough, okay, you treat accordingly, you add budesonide. Category B, usually they have mild symptoms, so they get some symptom relief with inhaled budesonide. It can be in the rotahaler or the inhaler with spacer. And if they have persistent symptoms by day 5, 6, 7, this is the right time to capture all those people and then decide whether they need admission. And that time you do the CRP if it's high, or if they are symptomatic, straight away do a CT scan to decide whether this patient needs or will benefit from remdesivir, and whether they need systemic steroids. I will not be talking about C1 and C2. So this is where you have to capture. So I would suggest that even if you can do a group teleconsult, like if you want to gather few, if there are too many people waiting to get a consult, you can even gather 50 patients together and do a group consult. It's not a bad idea. And then if any of them, if you can tell them what are the symptoms to watch for, and any of them with the symptoms, if they can volunteer and have a teleconsult where you can focus and put them in, that would be the best. Because if you are going to cater in large scale, you can even address them in a group. So just to summarize, category A, we do teleconsult, symptomatic treatment. Home isolation, it varies from government to government, so I'm not going to stress. In our state, it is 17 days, 10 days of strict isolation plus 7 days of restricted movement. In the sense, they can't go out of the house. And red flag signs we always teach. Every time when we have a telephonic consultation, we tell them and we ask them to repeat that these are the red flag signs where they have to call the doctor. Even if the doctor doesn't contact, they can contact to the nearest hospital and report. These are breathlessness, chest pain, drowsiness, falling blood pressure, hemoptysis, and cyanosis. And they're also advised to perform 6-minute walk test twice a day, because they will actually, they don't mind doing it because they know what to look for if you teach them. And when they have on exertion, if their saturation falls below 94, they voluntarily contact any of the hospital. Many a times our hospital, they directly report emergency because they are well aware. It is just we have to screen and tell them and reiterate. So this is a very easy test that can be done. There is no lab test that is needed to capture these sick patients. Coming to category B, again we do teleconsult. If category A need not be done alternate day, they are okay, you can do 3rd or 4th day consult, but ask them to come for a consult if they have any symptoms. Category B, we may follow closely every 2 to 3 days. High-risk individuals with persistent symptoms, as I said, cough or fever, anosmia, you can start on inhaled budesonide. In patients with moderate to severe or exertional desaturation, consider remdesivir, especially if the symptom is less than 10 days. We all know antiviral are useful only if the patient comes early, because only the 7 days, first 7 to 10 days at least, if you start an antiviral, it is useful. Later on, it is only inflammatory. So we should not be wasting this drug if they present 10th or beyond the 10 days. Again, any hospitalized patient or at home category B who are not mobile much, you can start on Clexane at home. And if you are admitting any category because of some reason, like pregnant women, you can discharge them for home isolation. They are asymptomatic for 72 hours and follow the same protocol. Teach them what are the warning signs that should be monitored at home. Okay, so I'm just repeating what's the timeline of illness. Week 1, 2, if you say that this is the intervention that we do. If they have respiratory symptoms, these are the patients you can see symptomatically, inhaled steroids. Then there is a role for antiviral. It can be favipiravir. There's not much evidence, but if that is what is available, you can start in the first week. And if they are sick to be admitted, you can start on remdesivir. Okay, so just giving another information, like this is the patient who is had a PTCA, and she presents with fever. He presents with fever. Saturation is normal. Already on azithromycin and ivermectin, had a course, and around 5 days later, she comes with a blood test which shows leukopenia. CRP is normal at this point, and 1 more day later, again she develops fever. So the fever pattern, if we ask them to chart it, you can find this is a saddle pattern. Okay, so there are some information that if you have a saddle pattern, the sense of fever is waning off, and then you have a slow rise, they usually do well than those patients who have a persistent fever. So this is an article that suggest what are the fever patterns that can suggest a cytokine profile and outcome. And they suggest a continuous fever have a poor outcome than this saddle pattern, because those patients with continuous high-grade fever, they are likely to go for cytokine storm. And as I said, this red flag sign should be taught to each and every patient so that they report voluntarily. This can be a persistent fever beyond 5 days, persistent cough, breathlessness or fatigability is an important thing, which we usually forget. The patient may come with severe fatigue, especially in diabetic patient. This is a warning sign, I feel, because it's a combination of dehydration, acidosis plus hypoxia. And saturation 90 to 94%, or a raise in respiratory rate. Any of this is enough. Okay, these are red flag signs. Please beware as well as educate all your patients about this. You can even message them so that they will observe all this automatically. Okay, so now coming to a little more severe case. Again, I'm giving a same picture, this man with SARS-CoV antigen positive. And now it's day 7. As you see, the saturation drops to 94%. Okay, so these tests are all done early. So it may be normal, but on day 7, her saturation fall. And what is the best treatment now? You have a CT severity score which is done on day 3, which is too early a CT. So that is why it is misleading you. It's not the right timing for CT. So you have a low CT score with a low saturation. And now what is the best treatment? Is it remdesivir? Is it remdesivir with systemic steroids? Is it remdesivir systemic steroids with anticoagulation? Or will you continue the inhaled corticosteroids with the Novak, that is newer anticoagulation, and ask him to wait at home? What do you want to do? What I would not do is a fourth. Definitely don't keep him at home. If it is 94%, that means he needs at any time oxygen. So he should be brought to hospital. It need not be an ICU. It can be any ward with oxygen support. What will you give? Because he's in day 7, he's an eligible candidate for remdesivir. I would start on that IV. I will give systemic steroids and I will give anticoagulation. I will not give any importance to CT because it is done on day 3. We all know early CT misses many things. So I will treat based on his symptoms and the duration of illness. So COVID, many things are based on the clinical symptoms, the saturation, the day of illness, more than anything. Only a CRP adds value than any other labs. CT helps when your COVID antibody, PCR is repeatedly negative and you are suspecting COVID. We have found a lot of cases where we have picked COVID by CT, but the PCR is negative. And later on, we do an antibody and confirm the diagnosis. So in such situation, we definitely do HRCT. In situation where the patient has symptoms, there is no hypoxia, but you want to know whether he will benefit from remdesivir. So you do a CT and if the CT severity score is more than 14, again, it suggests a moderate COVID. So that patients benefit from remdesivir, especially if they are less than 10 days duration. Again, those patients, we do CT. We do CT if the patient doesn't improve on treatment to know whether there is any complications. So what steroids, how long will you give and when do you give? How long do you give and do you taper? That's the most important thing. Certain patient is on steroid for long, for I would say weeks, and those patients usually are the ones who come back with mucor. So we have to be very judicious in choosing the drug, the dose, the timing, the duration, and when to stop. If you give steroid for up to 10 days, it doesn't need tapering. It just needs to be stopped abruptly. It can be done if the patient is not hypoxic. If the patient is hypoxic, after 10 days of steroid, please look for other causes. Is it pulmonary embolism? Is it pulmonary fibrosis? Can be, you can repeat a CRP at that point. If the CRP is normal, definitely again, he is not going to benefit from steroid anymore. You can at least try tapering the steroid and probably weaned off. Okay, so this is again a steroid comparison, which I'm not going to detail. We usually use dexamethasone or methylprednisolone. A dexamethasone of 8 mg is what we use. Highest dose that we are given is 20 mg if tocilizumab or any other nothing available, but I'm not going to elaborate because it is on all hospital-based treatment. And the highest dose of methylpred that we have used is 80 and up to 120 mg, nothing more than that for COVID. Because high dose of methylprednisolone 500 or 1 gram have been used in some centers, and we have seen such patients come with infections and including fungal infections. So this is the recovery trial. It says that the lowest dose of dexamethasone be used, IV or orally. If the patient can switch from IV to oral and the patient is stable, can take orally, you can give oral dexa. It need not be IV always. For 7 to 10 days or until discharge. Equivalent dose of methylprednisolone is 32 mg or up to 50 mg QX or hydrocortisone. We don't use hydrocortisone. We usually give methylpred or dexamethasone. So what they say is steroid reduces mortality and increases the likelihood of hospital discharge if we use in those who are hypoxic. Only in this group, not in others. Steroid should not be used in the first week of illness before the onset of inflammatory phase, which is usually beginning within 5 to 7 days after the onset of symptoms. They have said when not to use. So it's important. These are guidelines. JAMA, Recovery Trial and IDSA all suggest. So there is no benefit of using steroids in those non-hypoxic. We are doing more harm if we use in first 5 days. What about remdesivir? Again, these are the studies that support remdesivir in special situation. That is NEJM IDSA guideline. What do they say? In patient with comorbidities with hypoxia, especially within 7 days. And this need not be hypoxia. You can have other features also. What are they? Respiratory rate more than 24 per minute. Clinical or radiological evidence of pneumonia or on supplemental oxygen, not on NIV or intubation, not in the late illness. So you have to identify those patients, the correct timing. Timing is what is important for all those drugs to work, which I have said now. And this needs dose adjustment or nephroclearance if the creatinine clearance is less than 30. Colchicine, I'll just break a brief comment about colchicine. It is an anti-inflammatory drug you can use for those patients who have high-grade fever and those who are high risk. So it is an anti-inflammatory. It doesn't have any effect on the virus. So this they have done the study called Cold Corona study, where they have identified high-risk patients presenting early illness, and this is used as 0.5 BD for 3 days. And what I would say is this is better than steroid. If you want to use steroid for fever, please don't use. You can try colchicine to reduce fever. It just reduces the symptoms, nothing more. And they have tried only in this high-risk group, not for everyone. So whenever you start colchicine, you should know the side effects, especially the GI side effects. Okay, this is a word about anticoagulation. So this is a 73-year-old female who has a high-grade fever on day 3 and saturation is normal. So, okay, so what is the role of the following treatment strategy? Do you want to give remdesivir, steroids and anticoagulation? I would say no, because too early, maintaining saturation. Will you give plasma therapy, convalescent plasma therapy? Will you give tocilizumab? Will you give the new drug like baricitinib, which is used instead of tocilizumab if you don't get tocilizumab? Will you use antibiotics? If so, which antibiotic? Will you give monoclonal antibodies? So if you ask me, this is a high-risk patient who is a diabetic and has a coronary artery disease, and she can have a severe disease, and she is presenting early with a high-grade fever. Okay, so this, and the first choice will be out because this is saturation is normal, and this is not an inpatient, so they don't have any criteria to give any of this. You may give anticoagulation, they're not ambulant, that's all. Convalescent plasma therapy was used widely. This may be a patient for that, but it is not available now. Toci is already out because it is used only in those hypoxic less than 90%. Baricitinib again is not for, it's only for hypoxic patient. I don't use antibiotic for any of these patients with COVID, including azithromycin. What about monoclonal antibodies? This is a new drug that has come into market a couple of days back, available in India. It is available in Chennai, to be precise now. And this is this group of patients may benefit if they are not vaccinated, especially, that is seronegative population. We can give monoclonal antibodies with some benefit. We have evidence for that. So as I said, convalescent plasma therapy, it's given early, first 3 days of diagnosis, but it is very difficult to get a plasma from a recovered patient. So many times we lose that window unless you have a plasma bank. This is what I was talking about, the monoclonal antibody. It can be given as an outpatient therapy. The patient can come to your emergency or an outpatient clinic. You can inject this and then the patient can go back home. So this is called monoclonal antibody. It is available. It is recently. I'm not going to talk much about, but this is an option that is available, which is proven beneficial if you give within 5 days of symptom onset in high risk group, in those who are not vaccinated, that is seronegative, and in those patients who are transplant, who are immunocompromised, where you cannot give, you cannot, they are likely to progress to severe illness. Okay. So again, this monoclonal antibody has shown to be active against this Indian origin variant also. So that is a good news. And it is available in 2 doses, but 1200 mg doses will be sufficient. Okay. Antibiotics in COVID, as I said, we don't do any of this. We give IV antibiotics if the patient is suspected to have any other site infection or a secondary bacterial pneumonia. And many, guidelines say that there is no role for antibiotic, include our own government guideline. It should not be prescribed routinely. Okay, this is about thromboprophylaxis. So a patient going home after recovery from a COVID, and it's not an ambulant, can you give oral anticoagulation or post-discharge thrombophlebitis? Again, we have guidelines. What we follow is a modified guideline. Oral anticoagulation guideline. That is, we have specific indication where we can give prophylactic dose or a therapeutic anticoagulation, and this is based on their comorbidities, their age, as well as the D-dimer value. I'm not going to elaborate, but there is a role for anticoagulation for not much ambulant with a high D-dimer and based on the. Okay. Coming to some drugs which it's still debatable. I'll touch upon that. This is again an outpatient where the patient presents with a few days of fever and presents with GI symptoms, doxy, ivermectin, zinc already on. So what do you want? Do you want to give this 2DG? Yes. 2DG is recently very popular because it was promoted widely, including the ICMR and the AIMS. So it accumulates in the virus cells and it prevents the virus growth by stopping the viral synthesis and energy production. And it selectively accumulates in the infected cells. Okay, so by this inhibits the viral growth, that's a good thing about it. But we don't have good evidence. The phase 2 trials is conducted in 110 patients in October 2020, between May and October. And that is a safety study, phase 2, and it's found to be safe. And they compared with standard of care, but in the study, they have not defined the primary endpoint clearly. So what they are looking at is not clearly, so that the study was questionable. Phase 3 trials, they have recruited 220 patients between December and March 2021. And the results, they have shown that significantly higher proportion of patients in 2DG group improved symptomatically and became free from supplemental oxygen in comparison to those in standard group. So as of now, I don't know whether I would support 2DG. I would ask for more data on that. So we have not included in our protocol. So I summarize by saying this: give symptomatic treatment, attend to all their symptoms. That is very, very important, but educate them about the 6-minute walk test, warning signs, and have a follow-up based on the severity, either alternate day or every 3 to 4 days, and advise them when to call the hospital. So category B, inhale budesonide. Persistent symptoms, please evaluate, do a CRP and decide whether they need a CT. If the CRP is elevated, if they have persistent cough, and decide on heparin and remdesivir. How to follow up? This is the last slide. Teleconsult, around 5 to 7 days. That's the most important day to capture these patients who may deteriorate fast. Reassess for symptoms. That's important. If symptomatic, do a CBC CRP D-dimer and decide on CT chest. If there are warning signs, assess for admission even without abort test. Mild cough with fever, budesonide inhaler will do for symptom relief, they will find the symptom relief after 3 to 4 days, not with one puff. So you have to advise them that it will take some time, but please follow up such patient because those group may need systemic steroids. I will also reiterate there is no role for antibiotics, ivermectin, systemic steroids, especially in outpatient. Zinc, I don't know whether it's doing more harm because Mucor has an affinity to zinc as per some studies, but we don't have strong data. Steam inhalation, unless nasal block, don't advise steam inhalation. Convalescent plasma therapy is doubtful role. It may be beneficial, but it's not available freely. So we need not even include any of this in our prescription. About 2-DG, we don't have good published literature. But what we can look for is a monoclonal antibody, but it's very costly, which is not available, which is not the drug for everyone, especially for rural area where it's very difficult to supply the drug. And you can imagine the treatment costs 60,000 for this injection for an outpatient therapy. So with that, I will summarize and I will stop and I'll be open for questions. And I would invite Dr. Arjun to sum up and add points which I have missed out. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So that was very clear in terms of managing as an outpatient and also category 1 and 2 management and also referral and discharge planning. So your case studies have been exemplary. So did highlight quite a few points are also about the antibiotics and steroids, when to give and when not to give, with especially the concern with the mucormycosis and systemic infections. So we will have more questions from the delegates, but we'll get to see Dr. Arjun's viewpoints before we do that. So welcome, Dr. Arjun.
Thank you very much. Am I audible and are my slides seen?
Yeah.
Thank you. Let me thank IMA Tirunelveli for having given us this opportunity to interact with the audience here. I would just take a couple of minutes, 3 or 4 slides, just to reiterate some take-home points from what Dr. Rajalakshmi has been speaking. So when we talk of medications, very important to realize that antibiotics do not have any role in COVID. And another important thing which we should all know that in the first week, it is viremia that predominates. The virus captures the entire first week. And in the second week, the body starts its response and what we call as the inflammatory response. So in both of this, antibiotics do not have any role whatsoever. So what about remdesivir? As Rajalakshmi has told, it works well if it is given early within the first 10 days, that is all in the first week, in which the viremia phase predominates. In the first week, when the patient has symptoms and there are infiltrates on imaging, this can be given and it's a good drug if given at the right time. What about steroids? It's not indicated in early disease. That's a very, very important point because we see a lot of prescriptions on which steroids are prescribed on day 1 of the illness itself. It can be counterproductive given quite early in the disease because we know in the first week it's viremia. If steroids are given, it actually helps viral replication and causes a more severe disease. Watch for exertional desaturation, and that is the key word. So keep on monitoring the saturation at least twice a day, resting as well as exertional after 6-minute walk. And if the saturation falls less than 94%, that is the time to start steroids. And that is also the time if the patient is at home to immediately get medical attention and get admitted to a hospital. The drug that we most commonly use is Dexona for 7 to 10 days, but one can stop it when the hypoxemia resolves or the patient gets discharged, whichever is earlier. And there is no need to taper steroids when you give for 7 to 10 days. Anticoagulation is a very important aspect of treatment of COVID. All admitted patients need to be put on prophylactic anticoagulation with low molecular weight heparin, which is the standard of treatment for this group of patients. Only severe cases actually need therapeutic anticoagulation with twice daily dosage. And in certain selected patients in whom the D-dimer values have been very high or the patients have been in ICU for a prolonged period of time, they may need newer oral anticoagulants, coagulant agents at time of discharge for at least 2 or 3 weeks. Again, to reiterate the red flag signs, saturation less than 94% at rest or following exertion, persistence of fever beyond 6 or 7 days, severe breathlessness, intractable cough, altered consciousness, and extreme fatigue. If any of these signs are present, symptoms are present, it is very, very important to seek medical attention immediately, and the patient needs hospitalization for further evaluation and treatment. A word about Mucor, just what we should keep in mind. Whom are the patients in whom you suspect Mucor? Number one is patients post-COVID, who especially have uncontrolled diabetes, as well as patients who have been on steroids for a long time. These are the things that you ask for: presence of nasal block, facial pain, headache or redness of eyes. Look for blackish discoloration of the nasal cavity, blackish areas over the palate, redness of the eyes, sinus tenderness, swelling over the face. And if any of these are present, at the earliest, have an ENT consultation done. They need a surveillance nasal endoscopy to pick up mucor at the earliest, at the possible instance. So finally, this is my last slide. To sum up, we should know the red flag signs and always instruct the patients to watch out for the red flag signs. Timely referral is the key. The most, because we'll be able to save lives. Unlike the first wave of COVID, we are seeing more young patients being affected in the second wave, and most of them do not have any comorbidities. Unfortunately, this time the course of the illness has been quite drastic. We see sudden deterioration and death in many youngsters without any comorbid conditions. So other important thing is never treat lab values. Always clinically correlate. And if there is a clinical worsening with worsening lab values, give importance to that. Isolated elevated lab values, particularly something like ferritin and LDH, do not have any value at all. And finally, the most important key to success of treating COVID patients is giving the right medication to the right patient at the right time. Let me stop with these words. Let me thank you all for the patient listening, and once again thank IMA Tirunelveli for having given us opportunity to be part of your proceedings of this month. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Arjun. So that was very crisp. So you're summing up all the essential points. So it's more clear. So for people who have joined also a bit late. So in the last year, in 2020, we had more symptoms from the lung point of view. But this year, the phase of the COVID has changed, and also the age group. This is more inflammatory and vasculitic. Quite a few patients who had mesenteric, peripheral vascular, cardiovascular, pulmonary, and embolism. So we do see all of them. So there is more cytokines involved in all these things. So the outpatient management, yes, the right time is important. But to my understanding, the patients sometimes find it difficult to fix the date when they get the symptoms. So that's a hard bit for us. So fatigue may be the first symptom, which people don't bother. And then after 2 days, they get some myalgia that also don't bother. And then day 5 actually, but they will say, 2 days fever. So that is a hard bit, when you do a over the phone consultation and how to evaluate. So that may be one reason people tend to do investigations in a bit early on. But as you said, early CT will not be useful. Yes, but now people have more awareness in terms of home oxygen and pulse oximeter and blood sugar, all they have. So that was really a good talk today. We had nearly more than 100 participants today. So let's open the floor for the discussion. So perhaps I'll read the questions from the chat box first. So right time to do a CT chest and a steroids use. I think you answered earlier on, like day 5 to day 7, depending on the saturation. Hope I'm right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And then there was a question about home management using antibiotics and antivirals. Maybe you can clarify that.
Yeah, antibiotics, no.
Yes.
Antiviral, the favipiravir is the only oral option antiviral that is available.
Okay.
Used. I have not used much because I don't have much. I have not used, so I have an authority to tell that. We have one study, Indian study, that is from Dr. Udvadia, which have shown that there is a viral clearance. So if the patient is tolerating, there is no harm using as an outpatient therapy if they are symptomatic.
Yes, ma'am. So then in the media, hype about the remdesivir, and patients themselves asking, sir, remdesivir கிடைக்கிறதில்ல. So we can't take remdesivir, and can I start Fabiflu or Favipiravir earlier on? So that may be the question by the patients.
Okay. Yeah, if they are symptomatic, you can definitely. But
Okay.
FT monitoring should be done, and the pill burden, they have to take
Yes.
number of pills, GI problems, so that we can explain. Then the AST,
No,
Yes, they need to check about the liver functions. Yes, indeed, yes.
I think
Yes, yes, sir.
it's normal concern for general practitioners, like the patient asking them, sir, அந்த மாத்திரை கொடுத்தாங்க, இந்த மாத்திரை கொடுத்தாங்க, நீங்க ஏன் இந்த மாத்திரை, like for example, for antibiotics, we know rationally we should not use that, or steroids, we should not use that. But for a general practitioner, the problem every day is any patient who comes to the OP would ask, sir, என்ன எனக்கு ஊசி போடல, இல்லைன்னா எனக்கு இந்த மாத்திரை கொடுக்கல அப்படின்னு. This is a normal question. I think
Yes.
every general practitioner would accept that. And do you think really antibiotics would do no role, or is there any role for prevention of secondary infection, or should they be used in comorbids or patient with high risk?
So antibiotic has no role, sir. Why? Because we have used, to be very frank, we have treated around 4,000 cases, and we are very, very selective. If the patient is started on Dexona, they are not given antibiotic. They are just given, even if the CRP is 70, we don't give. The cutoff is 5 and you have a 70, we don't give. Because we know that it's COVID-related elevated CRP, and they do very well without antibiotic. They go out of hospital without antibiotic. So we have a trigger for antibiotic, that is a new onset fever on treat while on Dexona. We are concerned whether it's infection or a CRS, that is cytokine release syndrome. At that time, we definitely look for infection. We do a culture, we do a repeat imaging, and then if need be, we may do even a procalcitonin to decide whether this patient needs tocilizumab or treatment for CRS, or alternatively an antibiotic. That is a situation we think. Or if the patient has urinary infection, all those are different. But for starting Dexona, IV or oral, we don't give antibiotics. What I would suggest is, if you want a backup, you have a guideline that can be posted or keep it ready in your our OP or anything, so that you can use as a ready reference to teach the patient. This is what the guidelines say. So nobody will question or even find that you are at fault. So antibiotic is not given as a prophylactic measure when steroids are started. That is, I'm very clear about that, because it doesn't have any role, sir. It doesn't prevent any infection.
It's a very important take-home message. Two things. One is an early CT, which is going to be putting you into a safe mode, and the second thing is no antibiotics. It's very important for general practitioners to remember. And the third very important thing is early steroids. Early steroids are going to mask the symptoms, sometimes be harmful to the patient. Actually, I think there is three important take-home messages: no steroids, no early CT, and no early steroids, and no antibiotics.
Antibiotics.
No antibiotics. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Next question.
So shall I go on to the next question? There is any evidence of isolated predominant CNS involvement of COVID? Symptoms and manifestations you have come across, ma'am?
Yes, we have had cases of, but it is, GPS as a first presentation. Guillain-Barré,
Mhm.
we have 3 cases. So one was immediate, within a week of COVID. One was the first presentation, and later we found that the patient had a Guillain-Barré syndrome. Secondly, we had cases of encephalopathy, which we later thought it is encephalitis related to COVID, but we couldn't do a COVID PCR in the CSF to prove it. But we presume, because we couldn't find any other cause, that the patient improved. Apart from that, we didn't have any other classical picture of neuro complications.
Right, ma'am. Just to add, I just had a patient an hour ago who has Bell's palsy. So he's still in the evaluation for COVID. So no fever and Bell's palsy. So it may be not COVID. waiting for the reports.
Any evidence of like patients developing now? The newer patients that are coming up with abdominal symptoms, sometimes mesenteric artery thrombosis, and we have had we had few patients with abdominal symptoms, and we had around 2 cases of mesenteric artery thrombosis, and one of them, strangely, one of the patients were presented as an acute abdomen with COVID positivity, and we had to do a laparotomy, and we found all the intestines like thinned out, and strangely, it turned out to be a case of leukemia, presenting with a gastric crisis, and we lost the patient after the surgery about 3 days post-operatively. So mesenteric artery thrombosis, your experiences, or abdominal pain, your experiences.
So we have had cases of diarrhea and other hepatitis, presenting as hepatitis. We had thrombosis, including stroke. Even now we have currently one patient with stroke. We have had MI, we had DVT and other distal. But mesenteric ischemia, I have not encountered in this current last 2 years. Definitely it would have been reported because the pathophysiology is the same.
Yes.
And but what I would also highlight is there is a syndrome called MISA. Probably many of you would have heard, that is multi-system inflammatory syndrome in adults. That can present as abdominal pain, appendicitis, rash, and that comes as post-COVID. So if many of us wouldn't have tested, if one of the family member is affected, rest of the family member many times won't test. And their illness subsides, and after a month they may present with abdominal pain. And we have had cases where surgeons have admitted them as acute abdomen, and later on continuous fever, even they found that appendix is perop, they don't find anything, and later on they were diagnosed to have MISA, and we are given IVIG and steroids. So one end is COVID can present like mesenteric ischemia, any pattern including diarrhea. Another is post-COVID MISA can also present very variedly. Rash, fever, myocarditis, abdominal symptoms, diarrhea, and even acute abdomen. What they won't have as a post-COVID syndrome is, this MISA is, they won't have lung involvement. So that is the most important differentiating factor. They will have all system involvement and signs of inflammation. So both are possible, sir.
And that's a very important take-home message, that all abdominal gastrointestinal symptoms, please also rule out, take an RT-PCR before you label them as a gastroenteritis or any other symptom. Do an RT-PCR, confirm it's COVID, and then go ahead with treatment. It's very, very important.
Madam, good evening. I'm Dr. Raju. I'm a pediatrician.
Yes, sir.
Since you mentioned MISC, we call it as MISC, madam, multi-inflammatory system disorder, COVID related. We see quite a lot of cases. Even during the first COVID episode, we saw around 30 cases. They almost present like Kawasaki. There's only difference is the Kawasaki, the coronary dilatation takes some time to disappear, whereas this with one dose of IVIG or methylpred and with aspirin, it settles on its own. In Kawasaki, we give aspirin in high doses in the initial 7 to 10 days and then taper to over a period of 6 weeks. And here we taper suddenly, and of course, we follow it up, and we do not know because it's less than a year, so we do not know what happened to them. But they present with acute abdomen symptoms, they present with symptoms of vasculitis, and the face of it, you'll know this is a Kawasaki-like syndrome, is a MISC. So plenty of cases in children we get.
Thank you, Rajesh sir, for your input.
Thank you, sir.
Next question. What conditions do we do CT in pregnant women with COVID?
Okay.
Or we don't do at all?
Yeah, we do if need be. X-rays we do because we can do with shield and the low radiation, low exposure X-rays we can do if need be, if the patient need. But usually without X-ray also we can treat any pregnant woman. We give remdesivir under emergency use authorization with consent. We give steroids, and the steroid is based on the term of pregnancy, whether it's methylpred or Dexona. All this matters. X-ray we do. CT we have done with consent, especially if there was towards term, because the organogenesis is over.
Correct. Yes.
We have done that. If their patient is critically ill, and we need a CT to decide further.
Okay. There is another question is, which is best with the NIV or high flow oxygen? But there is more category 3 patients, I would say. But yes, free to answer.
Dr. Arjun, can you help me with that?
Yeah, both NIV and HFNC are equally effective. But the issue is that patients find HFNC better patients find it easier to tolerate HFNC as compared to NIV. And there are a lot of patients who feel claustrophobic when you put the mask on with the NIV on. Efficacy-wise, both are equally effective, but patient preference is usually for HFNC. And it is easy to taper the oxygen when the patient is on HFNC. The only disadvantage with HFNC is that it consumes a lot of oxygen as compared to NIV. In these days of oxygen scarcity, there will be a preference to use NIV over HFNC based on that point.
Is there anything to do with workup breathing, sir?
Workup breathing is, both of them actually help reduce the workup breathing, but perhaps because NIV is able to give some PEEP, workup breathing gets controlled better with NIV as compared to HFNC. But even with HFNC, if you give high flow of about 60 liters and 60% FiO2, somewhere at that range, you will be able to actually generate a PEEP of about 6 centimeters of water.
Madam, one question is, have you had any experience with the skin lesions associated with the COVID? I had 2 patients. We had one patient multiple blisters in the hand, and following which her hand went into fingers went into gangrene, and we had to go in for an emergency fasciotomy of the entire forearm. And we did a forearm fasciotomy, and we found that that was a radial artery leak. Actually, they had put in a Venflon, and because of that, and she was on anticoagulants, and we found a huge hematoma in the carpal tunnel, and we had to release it. And after that, it settled, and we are not very sure whether it was a COVID skin problem or was it a compartment syndrome because of bleeding.
Slightly compartment syndrome, so as you have described, there was a leak and hematoma. But COVID can cause rash. It can cause skin lesions that can mimic with any viral infection. And if there is a vascular insufficiency, it can cause digital gangrenes, especially with thrombosis, underlying thrombosis. And if you have MISA, you can definitely have a rash as a typical presentation. But these blebs and blisters, as you described, it looks like a typical of a compartment syndrome more than related to COVID.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Sir,
So
one more.
Next question is about role of adalimumab.
I have not used it. Is not in any
Okay.
guideline.
Yes,
Yeah,
but people are using it. Whichever is available, all maps
Yeah.
are being used.
Definitely.
Capacitive, baricitinib, NIBS, maps.
Yeah. Dr. Gerald has got a question, I think.
Okay,
Sir,
yes.
go ahead.
He is a medicine professor from Velammal, where I also visiting consultant. Yes, sir.
Madam. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, madam, for your excellent lecture, madam. Only one question, madam. How long it takes for the CRP and the D-dimer to become normal, madam, usually?
Okay.
Because whether we have to do that repeat testing at the end of 15 days or 14 days, or not necessary at all.
Not necessary, sir. So when the patient improves, we stop testing. That is our, just don't test because it will come back to normal. If the patient is not doing well and you're going to change your therapy based on the test only we do, because of the large volume of cases, and there are capping with all the tests and tests you do. There are expenses involved, there are capping, so we don't do unnecessary tests. Because if I will repeat a CRP, if the patient has ongoing fever, to decide whether the patient over and above steroids needs tocilizumab or
exactly, yes.
That is all. Even we cannot differentiate infection with CRS from CRS with this. We have to do simultaneously culture also and decide on to see. Otherwise, never repeat any test because they will be okay.
Thank you so much. What about our experience regarding pneumomediastinum and pneumothorax in HFNC? One or two patients are having
now Dr. Arjun can explain.
Yes, yes, Arjun sir.
We see a lot of mediastinum, pneumomediastinum particularly, and that is more seen in our patients who are on NIV rather than on HFNC.
NIV,
NIV, because of the pressures that are used, and the lung is very, very fragile in patients who are affected with COVID pneumonia. So that is, it's quite common, but most of them are self-limiting, and it gets absorbed within by itself within a few days. Unless the patient becomes worse, goes into the ventilator, then again needs high pressure, positive pressure ventilation. That is the time when you need to intervene and put in a tube in some cases. But most of them are self-limiting. If you reduce the pressures, give them minimal pressures and treat appropriately, then they will settle on their own.
Sir, a related question to Dr. Arjun. Now, when there is an HFO, when there is an IV or a HFO machine not available, now we are using a modified Bain circuit with an PEEP valve. What is your opinion on that, sir?
So I'm actually not too much involved in critical care because that is taken care of by intensivists. We have actually not had the need for that. We have so far adequate numbers of ventilators and NIVs and HFNCs, so such a thing has not come to.
And your opinion on the previous COVID? We have not intubated many patients. We have intubated very few patients, and we have found them very difficult to extubate them. Now, in the present COVID, we feel that sometimes patients intubated are doing better than the last COVID. What is your experience?
Exactly, sir. The same is the experience here as well. Last time, whenever if you intubated a patient with COVID, then virtually you lost the patient. In this way, we are almost able to take up more than 50% of the patients who are intubated. We have been able to successfully extubate them as well. So probably is it because of the way the mutant virus which is behaving differently, or probably because we are starting treatment at the earlier point of time as compared to the previous wave. Many of these factors may play a role in that. But the fact is that even if patient is ventilated, there's a good possibility that they may come out of the ventilation this time.
Yeah, it's a very important take-home message for general practitioners. Please do not keep patients for a very long time on 15-liter oxygen or 5 or 6-liter oxygen and delay the referral. It's very important that they get to a higher center at the right time rather than be delayed to the last stage when we cannot do anything. So it's a very important thing that it's referred at the right time. Please do not delay the referral.
Thank you. So next question, a reason why youngsters have severe COVID this season, is that because of the mutation or any additional factors, ma'am? Or Dr. Arjun, sir?
I think it is the Indian variant and the unvaccinated population. If you think the unvaccinated population now is a younger population than 60 plus, and healthcare workers, almost good number are vaccinated. That is one. And number two, we checked, we had very few tested for variants. We had 7 of our samples tested for variants in the second wave. Those are vaccinated, and 6 of 7 were Indian variant 6172. So we know that this variant is more infectious, that is, more numbers are affected. This variant can escape the immune memory, that is, those vaccinated can also get. And this variant can directly go into the lower respiratory without affecting the upper respiratory. So testing can be missed, and they may not present with upper respiratory symptoms. They may present with the lower respiratory symptoms. That means they may present even later. So the younger population is affected mostly because of the unvaccinated status. That plays a major role also. That's what I believe. But this variant is different from the previous. It behaves differently.
If I can add a point, I think unlike the first wave, in this wave, people are taking it a bit easy as well. Previous in the first wave, the minimum symptom they used to come, the first day or second day itself, the moment they start having a symptom, they used to come to the hospitals or seek medical attention. But now this wave, what we find is that many of the people, although they start to have symptoms, they delay seeking medical attention by at least a week till the symptoms worsen. So that is also another thing. And this especially seen in youngsters.
Another thing is that
last year they were not allowed to stay at home. Once positive, they were shifted to some other block. So this year nothing happens. You stay at home. stay away from the hospital. You know, that's
Can I ask one thing, sir?
yes,
The
sir.
initial symptoms of COVID, as Dr. Subramanian said, are highly non-specific. By the time they enter your chamber, they say it's a 2-day disease, but actually 8 days would have gone. Symptoms are not attributed to COVID according to them. They may feel some distaste or they may feel some disroutine in their activities, which we do not attribute to this viral prodrome. So that's what happens. So Madam said it's an 8-day disease. 7 days, 8th day, they become worse. So it's very difficult to identify in practice on which day they got the disease and what is the we start steroids. It's all very difficult. No.
So then what I would suggest, sir, we can do a CRP at that point.
Okay.
Yes.
That is the basic thing to start with. Then decide on CT. If the CRP is normal, saturation 6-minute walk test is normal, the CT will not help you to decide steroid. It is only the oxygenation and then you decide on CT.
Safely at that time, can we try that 800 microgram BD of budesonide?
If they have cough, fever, definitely.
Okay.
It is again given. It is again given best within the first 5 days.
First 5 days, the budesonide.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, that's okay.
Contrary to the discussion what we have, in many centers for all practical purposes, people do the CT first and then start their assessment rather, practically speaking, if they all agree. They don't get them in without a CT scan done. That is what has been normally happening here.
Yes, sir. So that's because for the hospital side of things, they want to know whether they need admission or not. So they need a CT. That's what they are pushing for. If the CT is normal, then they may manage as outpatient. That's what my thinking. Yes.
So it is
டைரக்டா சிடி எடுத்துற போயிடுறாங்க டைரக்டா சிடி எடுக்க போயிடுறாங்க
actually we had a
we should discourage people taking CT. To be frank, any of our doctors also ask the patient in the form to say take the CT and come. That is also one of the reason. Not only the doctors but the public. So both of us are responsible.
Sir, I can. Sir, excuse me, sir. Sir, I can say this is not wrong to have a CT at the first time, because as already said, the patients come with complaints a little bit later. As Raju sir said, they may come even after 1 week. So we cannot take risk of not taking CT. So ideal thing is we should take CT at the time of admission. Even if it's normal, then we have to repeat the CT after 5 days. That will be the ideal thing. Not taking CT at the first time of their visit, I don't think it's an ideal situation. We may miss patients, especially young patients. They may become bad if we don't take CT at the first time.
We had a very peculiar experience of having a daughter-in-law and mother-in-law. Mother-in-law have a CT positive and a COVID positive. So before she came to the hospital, the daughter-in-law decided that she should have a CT. And unfortunately, or fortunately, she was 40 days pregnant. And we had to do a medical termination of pregnancy because she was completely exposed to a CT, and also she had taken a few drugs before she could come to the hospital. I think, as Aziz sir said, it should be strongly not recommended to go for a CT before we can finalize the day of symptoms. I think Dr. Chandrasekhar has been waiting for long with the question. Sir, please go ahead, sir. Chandrasekhar, sir.
Sir, excellent lecture by both of them, sir. But one question, common question by all patients, which vaccine to be taken, Covishield or Covaxin? Actually, medically, there is no much difference. But when they ask, when they are given a choice, what is your suggestion, sir?
Okay. So I will answer a few things. One about Dr. Shafiq's CT. See, even in that case, if there is a clarity, those cases, if they come with a 3 days fever, you know that the symptoms is for 3 days, please don't do CT. I would discourage that. If you're not sure, you can do a saturation 6-minute walk and a CRP to decide on the CT. Because CT for everyone, we can't afford. India can't afford, So I think a CT should not be for all those patients especially for category B, only those selected cases and not for category A cases, definitely not. Secondly, regarding this CT, I was even thinking whether it is a low form of radiation for COVID-19. They are popular.
Radiotherapy.
I was thinking that why they are doing so much.
Low dose radiotherapy.
Oh, that's a bit, I'm not. So vaccines, coming to vaccines, sir, earlier I used to say grab whichever comes your way, either Covaxin or Covishield, because this year you take whatever you get. You can't choose this year. That's what I used to say. But if you have a choice, we know that Covishield has few advantages. One is we have good phase 3 trial. And number 2, if you are going to travel abroad, WHO and every airlines have approved only Covishield and the Pfizer vaccine. So if you want a certificate which has to be going through by air, you have to fly. This is important for this year. Next year, you can probably vaccine will also be included. You can choose. Regarding immunity, I think it's fairly the same. There won't be much difference between these two vaccines.
Ma'am, to that Covishield is more useful in the Indian variant, if I'm correct?
Yes. If you have 2 doses, the protection is around 60%. If you have only 1 dose, 50 to 60%. If you have 1 dose, it is only 35, 30.
Better than Covaxin. The Indian variant is more susceptible to the Covishield than Covaxin. That's what the study says, until the Pfizer is available.
But the best protection is around 65%.
Things may change, madam. After sometime they say this has 159 spikes and that can it will almost like Usain Bolt's shoe spikes. It may go up.
That leads
vaccine. No, sometimes it's not. You take one Covaxin.
Yeah, wait for the change. Wait for the change.
Spikes may go up.
The biggest question in the media today is this made in the lab and let out on purpose, because India has become such a big victim to it. And today the biggest debate on media, if you go into social media or into regular media, you find, is it a biowar? And if you see the number of vaccines, now the triple mutant has come into India and found in India. So sir's question really, which vaccine will work in India?
It may depend on the number of spikes.
Yeah, and
not the shoe spikes.
Pfizer, I am not very sure, because at minus 70 degrees, our cold chains, even with minus 5 degrees, is not working so well. At minus 70 degrees, it's a big question mark whether it will work in India. Yeah.
And then this is a personal question, madam. You said ivermectin is not useful. We accept. But the time-started levamisole, vermisol, which we use as an immunomodulator in nephrotic syndromes. Had there been any trials on levamisole with COVID, madam?
I am not aware of, sir. I'm not
Why not
sure.
it be used? Because before this, the resistant type of tuberculosis, before this 8 years, when before that we had this gene expert and rifampicin resistance and all, we used to try the intermittent dose of levamisole for those patients who are not responding to the conventional anti-tuberculosis things. They used to respond. This is a practical thing, because I have got around 43 years of practical experience. So is there any trial? I just wanted to know, because it's a better immunomodulator compared to ivermectin. Just because Bangladesh took up, just because Australians took up, it has come to the market like a bang. But why not it be levamisole?
I'm not aware whether any serious study is going on levamisole. And there were some immunomodulator tried with the vaccine, Mycobacterium bovis, with NTM vaccine, with all the side effects of infection. With levamisole, I'm not sure. And currently what is in the market is the monoclonal antibody, which is expensive, which we can use for selected group. I don't know whether it is for India. I don't know how far we can use that. But
supposed to increase the NK cell activity and all. There have been lots of trials with levamisole, even with the nephrotic syndromes, which we had been using for over 3 decades now.
Kesav, sir, I had some questions, sir. Kesavan sir, கை தூக்கிருந்தீங்க sir.
Okay, while waiting for him, maybe can I read another?
How about the expecting the third wave? Because
Am I audible?
Yes sir, Kesavan sir.
I am audible then.
Yes, sir.
Sometimes, as an ophthalmologist, I am saying conjunctivitis sometimes is the presenting feature for the COVID. I have not seen, but I have heard from my brother-in-law, an ophthalmologist, and also from ophthalmologists from Chennai, and all these people. Sometimes conjunctivitis is the presenting feature, and later on they get the other symptoms and then diagnosed. Recently, one of my classmate who is a pharmacist in the medical college days, he had WhatsApp consultation with me for conjunctivitis. Later on, after some days, I come to know he was COVID positive and got it treated. So that has to be known to everybody. Sometimes conjunctivitis will be the same presenting feature for this COVID-19. That's what. Thank you. It was a good discussion, and I thank Aziz, also my classmate, for this arranging this CME.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir. The next question to the panel: long-term pulmonary complications of COVID pneumonia.
COVID pneumonia per se does not cause any long-term pulmonary complications.
Okay, very
There are some people who are prone to develop what is called post-COVID fibrosis. Although in real terms, you really cannot call it fibrosis, because by the end of 2 or 3 months, if you repeat a CT, you find that entirely all the fibrosis or bronchiectasis or whatever is there will completely disappear off, just melt off like anything. So in true terms of radiological parlance, you really cannot call it fibrosis. We call it post-COVID sequelae. There are certain people who are more prone to develop this, particularly patients who have uncontrolled diabetes, who have been in the ICU for a long time, who have been oxygen dependent. All these patients may have lingering symptoms which last for a longer period of time. So that is all. But what we really find, and with our experience from the first wave particularly, is that most of them completely resolved by the end of 2 or 3 months.
Thank you.
Sir, two.
Yes, that's right.
One is, what is the role of balanced fluids like lactate-free solutions in COVID? And second is injectable omega-3 fatty acids, which are being recommended now in COVID. Any experiences?
What is the first question, sir?
The first balanced isotonic solutions, like lactate-free, calcium-free solutions in COVID are better than the regular crystalloids or the colloids which we are using regularly. Is there any role for them? And some people are saying about omega-3 fatty acids in injectable forms.
So we don't give any fluids unless the patient is hypotensive or dehydrated. So COVID doesn't have any role for fluids, unlike dengue. So there is no role for any such things, and no role for omega-3 fatty acids or anything like that. That will not alter either the immunity or the outcome.
Okay.
Thank you. Difference between immunity developed due to COVID disease and vaccination. So my understanding is, you get a COVID disease, that is the greatest vaccination. But I'll wait for the speakers to answer.
Yeah, so COVID disease related immunity will also not, as we understand, will not last so long, because we have had instances where the people can get second infection. So even for those affected, we advise the vaccine after a period of time gap. And we all know that any viruses will stimulate the T cell mediated immunity, which is good, which is long lasting. But with COVID, we have had seen many cases of second infection. So we advise vaccine. So infection alone again will not be foolproof, that it doesn't last long. That is the problem.
Nowadays, people have first dose. Before the second dose, they get infection.
Yes.
Now the government regulation says, you have to wait for 3 months after the infection to get the vaccination.
Yes, sir.
So then they have a longer period of the between 2 doses, they have a prolonged period. So what do you advise?
That is fine. They have clearly said, and it's also that after infection, definitely you will have antibodies circulating for 3 months.
Yes.
So you can postpone your thing, and that will be a good boost. You had the first dose, you had infection, and after a gap of 12 weeks, the vaccine, it is a boost. So that the duration between the two vaccine doesn't matter in that case because you had a COVID infection in between.
Okay.
That is the usual practice in United Kingdom also, if I am correct, ma'am.
Yes, it done now. The Lancet journal says you can postpone between 12 and 16 weeks.
16.
But 12 weeks is the usual.
Yeah, when do you label a patient as a long COVID? And second is there's so much hype about the oxygen concentrators. Do they really work? Can we recommend it as a OP patients for patients who are oxygen dependent?
I will answer that. When the patient has symptoms which are persistent for more than 3 or 4 weeks, then you say that the patient is suffering from long COVID syndrome. Particularly, most of these patients are hypoxic and they need long-term oxygen. The question of oxygen concentrators basically come in 2 types. The one that is commonly available gives a flow of oxygen up to 5 liters. But then you have concentrators which can give up to 10 liters. That is the more, they are very, very expensive in fact. The low flow concentrators are the ones that are commonly used, which we use for patients who suffer from COPD and ILD who are in the terminal lung disease. Patients who need minimum oxygen requirement, like about 2 liters, 3 liters or 4 liters, they can use this concentrator, particularly if they need oxygen for a long time and there is no other need for them to stay in the hospital. They can be at home and use this concentrator. So that is the only place where this comes in. But if the oxygen requirement goes up beyond 5 liters, these will not be helpful.
Thank you.
Next question. Role of antibody titers after vaccination to decide whether need another booster dose after 2 doses of vaccination now?
No, the third vaccine who is going to give?
It may come for the health provider in 6 months' time.
Okay.
We don't know.
Second itself is a luxury.
Yes, yes, understand that. Yes.
So the antibody titer is done only to satisfy one's own satisfaction. That's all, and it even gives a false protection, and they may walk around without a mask. So what I suggest is you can do it. We are doing it as a part of study to know that currently in KIMS it's a funded study. So we are looking at the antibody titer in those vaccinated and from those not vaccinated, and those are infected, 3 arms. So it can be done to understand. And if you have anti-spike antibody, that means the vaccine is working. That is, you have produced antibodies against the vaccine. But you know that the vaccine efficacy is, especially the Covishield, is 70 to 80%. And against the Indian variant, it's only 60% around. So keeping in mind, we have antibody, which is maybe protective, but it is not foolproof. We have to follow all the precautions. If you don't have antibodies after 2 doses, then that happens in certain population, that is those who are on dialysis in CLD where they're not immunogenic. They may be on high dose of steroids or immunosuppressants for any other reasons. They will be less immunogenic. So whether they will benefit from another booster might not be. They may not even benefit. Whether we have to try any other mode, whether another vaccine, we may try a vaccine with a better efficacy after a period of time. We don't know. There's no answer as such. So these are the answers. So some population may not produce a good antibody, like some don't produce anti-hepatitis B levels, anti-HBs level even with good vaccine 3 schedule, especially in dialysis and certain populations. So they have to be very careful. And those patients actually, if they have infection, they are the group who are going to get maximum benefit with the newly introduced expensive monoclonal antibodies. If you give right time in the early illness, they may not progress to severe illness.
Okay, ma'am. Perhaps maybe 1 or 2 questions because in nearly 20 past 10. Yeah. So COVID patients, COVID in a COPD patient, how they behave and the prognosis and mortality is high. Dr. Arjun, please.
So very interestingly, what we have observed is patients who have asthma and COPD, very few of them turn up with COVID infections. Perhaps because they stay put in the home, they are using masks, they are not getting the viral infections which usually cause the exacerbation. Having said that, we have had patients with COPD and asthma who get affected with COVID, and they also do well if diagnosed properly and treated on time. The outcomes are same as those who do not have the disease. The other important thing that we have observed is patients, particularly patients with asthma who are already on their inhaled corticosteroids, they tend to do extremely well even with the rest of the family members getting affected with COVID and having more symptoms. These people surprisingly have much less symptoms. Perhaps that again gives added value to the reason why budesonide now has come up in a big way in mild COVID.
Sir, one question to you, sir, Arjun sir. How long do you advise pirfenidone for? Is it really useful in fibrosis post-COVID? One. Second is, there is some says like if you have a tuberculosis and you have a residual like a scarring or something like that, you are resistant to COVID. Your experience, sir.
So number one, the drug that we use as an antifibrotic, our preference is to use nintedanib rather than pirfenidone. Basically, because of the reason that because nintedanib has a faster onset of action, it starts acting within 2 or 3 days. Pirfenidone, on the other hand, will take almost 30 days to start acting because that is the time that is needed to build up the full dose of pirfenidone. So we very rarely use the pirfenidone because nintedanib now is very cheap and easily available in our country as well. So there are very certain limited indications to decide when to give nintedanib. Number one is patients who have persistent hypoxia. Number two, patients who have had long stays in the ICU and continue to be hypoxic even at the time of discharge. Number three, there are very specified CT patterns which will help us identify the patients who are more likely to develop lung COVID-related sequelae in the lungs, like presence of traction bronchiectasis, presence of dense consolidation, irregular consolidation. There's so many signs which have been described. In those patients, we start nintedanib. The period for which we give it is 3 months.
Tuberculosis, sir?
Tuberculosis, I have not heard of that, and we have not come across such a correlation between TB and COVID. Having said that, there are a lot of patients with COVID in whom we simultaneously pick up tuberculosis because there are many patients with COVID who present with hemoptysis. And there are, and we have at least had 3 or 4 patients in whom we have been able to make a diagnosis of concomitant COVID plus TB.
Thank you, sir.
Have you seen pulmonary embolism, sir, with the COVID?
Extremely common.
Yes. Okay.
Extremely common.
Okay. So maybe one last question about secondary bacterial infections post-COVID or any fungal infection apart from mucor.
We have had cases, actually, we had looked at our secondary bacterial infections in our ICUs and we have made an abstract also. So what we found was less of candida. In North, if you say, there are a lot of candida infections. So the main problem with COVID is lack of infection control in the ICU. One, they wear the PPE and gloves, and once you wear a gloves, you feel that you are protected and the patient is also protected. So they fail to use hand rub between patients, which they used to perform better without a glove.
Yes.
Nobody to monitor.
No.
Before COVID, infection control nurses used to visit these ICUs, monitor, do audits. Now, where is an audit? No, nobody enters because there's no manpower to do all this. So infection control goes for a toss. So the patient line-related infection is always a concern. We had seen a surge of candida infections, secondary gram-negative infections in those patients because all these patients stay in ICU for weeks. So they will have central line, some are in ECMO, some are on ventilator. So secondary bacterial infections are common, and in North it was candida. In our ICU, the rate was less, especially the candida. So candida, the risk factors are first is central line and second is broad spectrum antibiotics, plus or minus TPN or any abdominal source. So as the patient duration of ICU stay goes on, there is exponential increase in the secondary bacterial infection. So it can be usually a secondary bacterial infection, which can be a ventilator-associated pneumonia, or it can be a device, a line-related infection. And so any fever, we do take cultures and look at the X-ray to know whether there's a dense consolidation to suspect on the requirement of FiO2P, whether it goes up, and decide on antibiotics, even without a culture sometimes, because these patients are on stiff dose of steroids. You cannot differentiate a leukocytosis from infection or steroid. They won't have fever, good pattern, and some have received tocilizumab. Again, aspergillosis, again, we keep a low suspicion, low threshold to suspect post-tocilizumab. And mucor, obviously, they present now very often in the OP also, and we get a lot of referral from Tamil Nadu, Nagarkoil and Salem and Tirunelveli also, because for surgical debridement and for amphotericin.
Thank you, Dr. Rajarashmi and Dr. Arjun. So that was a fantastic. It's nearly 2 hours. So the discussion will carried on. So hope it has given much insight to all our practitioners in the southern districts. So I'll hand over to our treasurer for customary vote of thanks. Thank you.
I think it was thank you very much, madam and sir, and also to CEO sir. And it has been, we hit a century actually in the number of participants, and still there are around 70 participants who are still active, and it was a very interactive session. Thank you very much, both of you. And I hope we achieve the purpose of getting GPs to refer cases early, not to use antibiotics indiscriminately, and early use of steroids. And I think that was our aim when we ran the CME, and hope we have hit the nail in the head. And general practitioners very aware that they are the important link today, because tomorrow there is going to be a bus of cases from the rural areas to all our referral centers, and I think you are the keys there, and I think your patients listen to them rather than to us, even if so. Get them early, don't use steroids, don't do early CTs, and don't use antibiotic indiscriminately. And thank you very much for this beautiful CME. And I think we'll hand over to Ibrahim for the thanks.
So thank you, sir. It's a wonderful session, exceeding almost 2 hours. So the main key points: steroid use and no antibiotics, no antivirals, early referral to the tertiary care center, and timing of symptoms is very important. So both the speakers had done a wonderful job. And one thing which the audience may not be aware, most of the audience may not be aware, is both the speakers are their own better halves, their husband and wife, which may not be aware by many people here. And both the speakers had done a wonderful job. They complemented each other very well. And I thank the speakers, the moderators, Dr. Francis Roy, our president, and our vice president, Dr. Subramaniam sir. And a special thanks to our Dr. Aziz sir from Tengasi, and also Dr. Thirumalai Kolundu from our branch, who helped us in arranging the speakers, both the eminent speakers. And regarding vaccination, always the question will be there. So whenever I get the question of vaccination, I tell that vaccination is like you have an option of love marriage. So you get either one girl or another girl. And if you think for a long time, you may get a girl of an arranged marriage. So you may not be aware of who is that. And now the problem is there is a Russian girl is also there. But now our people are still expecting more. They're expecting when the Pfizer, the American girl, will be coming. So that's how the thing is. So even if you wish or not, you will somehow get married or somehow get the that COVID infection. So better get go for a love marriage before an arranged marriage. And regarding this presentation, we have already hit a century. There are a lot of audiences who are unable to enter because our limit was only 100, because this is the first time we are crossing this number. And for all those who are unable to enter, this will be posted in our official IMA Tirunelveli YouTube channel, and this will be the link with the permission of the speakers. I guess both will be giving us the consent, and it will be posted in our YouTube channel. And this time we had audiences from almost 11 IMA branches, from 4 districts. From Thoothukudi, Tirunelveli, Nagarkoil, and Kanyakumari, and Tengasi districts. 4 districts we have got. And we had audiences from not only from India, from abroad also. And Dr. Chandrasekharan, IMA Tiruchendur, Tuticorin, he joined from US. He is not in India. He joined from US. The time there is, I think it is now between 10 to 12 a.m. And that's how the things are going on. And a special thanks to our KIMS chairman, Dr. Sadadullah, for joining us in the initial part. And I thank all the participants and the ground, the floor interaction was very awesome. Many had very good questions. And the reason why we chose this topic, that is OP management, is we have started receiving a lot of cases from rural areas because of mismanagement and high over management. In fact, over management without proper sequences. So it's to rectify that, we had this topic. I hope we as the organizers and the speakers have done a very good justification for this topic. I thank once again everyone, and I once again request everyone who have not got vaccinated to get vaccinated soon. Stay safe and take care of your near and dear ones. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.